You're listening to Journalists on Journalism, a weekly podcast brought to you by the Stanford Graduate Program in Journalism. For more information and upcoming speakers, visit journalism.stanford.edu. Welcome to the November 10th edition of the Stanford Journalism Forum. I'm Julia James. This week's seminar featured Jon Krosnick, a Stanford professor of communication, political science, and psychology, and a senior fellow by courtesy at the Woods Institute for the Environment. In this podcast, Krosnick talks about the media's use of surveys and polls in general, and the role of pre-election polls in the 2010 midterm elections in particular. Krosnick started out by pointing to the widespread use of polls by media organizations, both to survey the public's beliefs, desires, and actions.
And this is a very interesting exception to the normal process of news gathering and news distribution, because in a sense, this is news generation.
And also to monitor consumers' use of journalistic information and to guide how journalism organizations choose to devote resources.
So if you think about the journalistic world moving to the internet, so many of my friends who are journalists talk about the fact that, as I'm sure you know better than I do, that journalism is being driven tremendously powerfully by clicking behavior. And the more clicks a website gets, the happier they are. And the more clicks a story gets, the more likely it is that there will be more stories on that same topic.
Despite variations in methods, pre-election polls in particular are startlingly accurate in predicting outcomes, Krosnick said, with one notable exception. During the 2008 presidential race,
there was no consistent bias of any one poll over others except for Fox News. And it turns out that Fox News always underestimated Obama's share of the vote compared to other polls and always overestimated John McCain's share of the vote. So let me ask you, why do you think that might be? I'll rephrase the first explanation as saying the people who did the poll might have made decisions about how to collect the data or how to analyze the data to make McCain look better. But the second possibility is that the researchers are just doing normal research procedures just like every other organization is, and one of those procedures is that when their interviewers call on the phone, the first thing they say is, "Hi, we're calling from Fox News to interview you about your opinions about the election." And people who hate Fox News hang up, and people who love Fox News stay on the line.
Survey work doesn't happen in a vacuum, Krosnick said.
There's lots of evidence that participating in a research study can change you in various ways. So, for example, if I interview you for an hour before the election about politics, that will make you more likely to vote on election day. And so research itself can have impact on its participants. So there are two ways in which I would say polls could influence the outcomes of politics. One is by affecting the people who are interviewed. And as I've told you, interviewing people about politics increases their turnout and increases their interest in politics. The second potential effect is often talked about with the label bandwagon effect. So for a long time there's been a speculation that if surveys show that Harry Reid is leading Sharon Engel, that will send a signal to Nevada voters that, I guess a majority of the other people who live in this state are favoring it. There's some validity to it. So maybe I ought to think that as well.
And that raises some big ethical questions, both for pollsters and the journalists who would like to write about official survey results, or even run their own informal surveys.
I think the interesting question is, can you call it journalism? And if it's journalism, then of course it doesn't need IRB approval. And I think if you stand back and squint, you could certainly say, well, yeah, it is journalism. I mean, so much of journalism is one human being asking questions of another human being and recording the answers and doing something with those answers. And I would assume that in a journalistic context that the journalists would reveal who they are and what they're doing and why they're doing it. So, in fact, probably all of the ethical requirements would be met.
And in the best tradition of broadcast news, we'll have to leave it there because we're out of time. Tune in next week to hear from Dylan Tweeney and Joanna Perlstein of Wired. This is Julia James for the Graduate Program in Journalism at Stanford University.